All right. Hello, my name is Katherine Lyman, and I'm so happy to be presenting here at Psychedelics today. Um, I'm a fifth year medical student at Stanford School of Medicine in California. And I'd like to start off today by telling a story about a hypothetical person. The story is completely made up, but it will be an example of the type of person I'm going to be talking about today as I present. So this woman is named Susan. She is 28 years old, and she lives in Kentucky. And she grew up there in a Christian family. Both of her parents were very devout, and they practiced certain forms of spirituality, which were sometimes quite dramatic and intense in her family. So when she was a child, her parents told her that when she went and prayed at night, she could expect to hear answers from God. And they meant literally that she could hear answers from God, not necessarily with her ears, but maybe in a spoken voice in her head. And her mother told her that this is what happened when she prayed. Her father said the same thing, that every once in a while you might hear God speaking to you. And so Susan, as she was growing up, really sought out these experiences, being able to hear the voice of God. And she was successful. So, as a child and as a teenager, from time to time, she would hear God speaking to her when she would pray, usually simple things, expressions of love, or little directions for what she should do with her life. So, Susan grew up, went to college, and then got a job as an accountant in her hometown. And life was going well for her until she was about 25. And she noticed that her prayers started to change at this point in time. When she would pray and listen for answers from God, instead of hearing one or two phrases or a sentence at most, God would speak to her at length, maybe for a whole hour. And as time went on, God started to speak to her more and more and more. And what God would say to her would become increasingly complicated. And he would start to share with her secrets of the way the world really works, and secrets of what her friends were saying about her behind her back, and of how people were persecuting her. And over time, the voice of God started to tell Susan that she was actually the devil incarnate. And soon other voices began joining in as well. And she started to hear them all day long, every day, 24/7. She could never stop hearing all these voices. And they became more and more menacing, more and more oppressive as time went on. So eventually, Susan's roommate noticed that she hadn't been eating for several days. She looked quite sick, didn't seem like herself. The roommate started to worry, and so she took Susan to the emergency room, where she was admitted to the hospital and diagnosed ultimately with schizophrenia. So Susan was very lucky, and she was able to get set up with a great care team, good psychiatrists and good therapists. She got on some medication that really helped her, and she stopped hearing all of these voices. And Susan had a lot of insight into her illness. And so with time, she realized about herself, I have this diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it means that sometimes my mind can create the sensation of hearing voices, even when they're not real. And so she learned that this is how her mind worked, and she couldn't always trust what she heard in her mind. But then Susan was faced with this dilemma, thinking back to the experiences she'd had growing up as a child and as a teenager, where she had heard God speaking to her from time to time, simple expressions of love, and how those experiences had been so important for her and had really set the foundation of her beliefs about the world, about her life, about the universe. And she found herself feeling quite lost and not knowing if she could trust those experiences anymore. So, as I mentioned, the story of Susan is entirely made up, but it is based on truth. And the experience that this fictional character went through is very similar to the experiences of many religious people and people who practice spirituality who develop mental illness and who go through psychosis. And so many people face this crisis where they can't be entirely sure how to keep spiritual elements of their lives, unusual experiences that maybe don't fit the regular script of reality, but which are still very important and can even be part of a healthy life for them. So I designed this study, the Psychosis and Spiritual Experience study, and have been working on it for the past couple of years to explore this question of how people deal with this special kind of conflict. And the presentation I'm going to give you now is similar to some I've given in the past, because I've been working on this for several years now, but I'm always updating it as I find new things about this topic. So I'll start with outlining the basic question, which is, how do people who endorse having experienced psychosis and spiritual experience distinguish between those two experiences? And just to define some of these key words I'm using, psychosis here is an abnormal experience of reality within the context of mental illness. And then a spiritual experience for my study is an abnormal experience of reality within the context of spiritual or religious practice. I think this is a very relevant question. As I illustrated in my story, many people have to deal with this. And I made a word cloud of the transcripts that I used in my own interviews about psychosis and about spiritual experience. I uploaded those and found some of the most used words. And as this word cloud here shows you, the word right in the center is voices, because the experience of hearing voices is so common in both psychosis and in spiritual experiences. And that just shows you how confusing this whole thing can be when people are trying to place labels on the experiences that they've had. So what does this have to do with psychedelics? Psychedelics produce a lot of unusual experiences of reality. Some psychedelics were originally developed in order to be psychotic-like. And they're also used to facilitate spiritual experiences. So I think it's helpful when we're thinking about these substances and how they should be used to explore these questions about the difference between psychosis and spiritual experiences. And so I've listed some of these questions here that we might have. Is there actually a difference between these two states? Are both of these states desirable? Should one be avoided? And how does all this influence the precautions we might develop around psychedelic use? So now I'll talk about the methodology of the study, which I designed. The basic exclusion and inclusion criteria had to do with whether a person had experienced psychosis as well as a spiritual experience in the past. So it's very important that they had both, and that there was at least some kind of separation between these two labels in their mind. So, some people would consider all their experiences to be under the umbrella of mental illness, or completely under the umbrella of a religion or of a spiritual power. And neither of those two groups were qualified to be in my study. I completed semi-structured interviews with each one of my subjects and asked each one of them basically 3 questions to tell me about their psychosis, to tell me about their spiritual experiences, and then to compare the two. And these interviews would last 2 to 4 hours. I also used a variety of scales, which I've listed here, to really assess very specific elements of both experiences. The Picala Quantifying Consciousness Scale, for example, the second one, assesses about 15 different criteria that can be used to help paint a picture of an altered state of consciousness. It asks questions like, were you entirely within yourself during the experience, or did you feel like you were outside yourself? Were you connected with other people or isolated? Were you thinking in words or thinking in images? Do you have clear memories of the event, or is it hazy? And asking all these questions can help you to really compare, how do all those criteria measure in a spiritual experience versus in psychosis? The people who participated in this study are a very diverse group. I interviewed people who are originally from the US, from the Netherlands, Estonia, and China. Multiple gender identities were present in my population. And then here's my list of diagnoses that my subjects had. Basically here, a wide range of mood disorders as well as thought disorders, but the common theme is every person had to have psychosis as some part of their diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And then here I have a list of the religious and spiritual groups who participated in this study. Many different religious labels that people ascribe to, and notably a lot of people had more than one religious label that they use for themselves. For example, several of my participants had grown up in more Orthodox traditions, but then as they become adults, as a result of the experiences that they go through, some of them transition to shedding the religious label, but still being spiritual. And some people had multiple affiliations and denominations. And now here on this page also, I have pictures around the edge that show you different types of spiritual experiences that my subjects would talk about. So for example, here on the top left is the collective unconscious described by psychologist Carl Jung. Jung described this collective place that all of humankind can access on a very deep level, full of meaning for all of us. And some people who I interviewed talked about spiritually being able to access this place and feeling united with all of humankind. This is a woman praying, and many of my subjects talked about praying, getting answers to prayers. This picture of the cat represents the role of animals in magic, which some people talked about, and using magic in their spiritual life. Up here in the top right corner, we've got a family at church together, and a lot of my subjects talked about these kind of communal religious settings and experiences as being really key for them. This is a Ouija board, and some of my subjects talked about using Ouija boards or using other kind of occult devices or magical devices to create special experiences. And then here we have a picture of a ghost. And this is something I also heard in my interviews, is people being able to see spirits or ghosts. So now going on to some of the results of my study thus far, and these are still preliminary results. But the biggest thing that I'm trying to find is, how do people distinguish their spiritual experiences from their psychosis? And I identified 7 groups in terms of how people do this. So each one of these groups represents a certain rule that a person developed for themselves, which was mentioned by at least 2 people in my interviews. And so I'll go over some of them right now. The most common group, I call it the emotional group. And these people just described having a peacefulness, blissfulness, feeling comfortable and hopeful and sometimes euphoric during their spiritual experiences. Whereas their psychosis was the opposite. It feels wrong, it feels terrible, they feel afraid and disgusted and ashamed. And so 50% of the people I interviewed talked about this emotional dichotomy as being one of their key indicators for what type of label they were going to use for their experience. The next group, I call this the orthodox group, and these are people who really focus on whether their experiences are consistent with their spiritual beliefs and values, or if they're inconsistent. And those that are consistent with their beliefs get the label of a true spiritual experience, while those that are kind of contradictory are labeled as psychosis. So this might be someone who turns to the Bible to see, this a vision that I just saw, does the Bible back it up? Does the Bible say that a person can have a vision like that and it would work that way? Or does the Bible say that a vision like that is probably a trick of the mind? And so they'll allow the Bible to settle the question and to help provide them with their real labels. So nearly 40% of my subjects talked about this kind of orthodox approach. Same number of people talked about this next approach, which I call reality validation. And these are people who try to be a little bit scientific and try to really find external support for their conclusions. So if they've had an unusual experience and it seems to be backed up by real life outcomes, then they're likely to label it as a true spiritual experience. So this is somebody who maybe heard the voice of God talk to them saying, go run into the room next door. You need to check on your child. They run into the room next door and their child is there silently choking, and they're able to save the child. So this for them is backed up by a real life outcome. Like, that produced a real good result in my life. So I think that was a real spiritual experience. Versus psychosis doesn't really do anything for you. It fails reality testing. Maybe your trusted spouse or friend is there with you and they say, no, there's nothing there. That's not real. It's something your mind is making up. So this is the reality validation group. The contextual group, this was endorsed by 25% of my subjects. And this group really has an easy time because they say that their religious experiences, their spiritual experiences are completely different from their mental illness symptoms. They happened at a different time in their life, different circumstances, different form. There's really nothing in common between the two, and they've never once for a second been confused about which part of their life was mental illness and which part of their life was a beautiful spiritual experience, which they cherish. For the sake of time, I'll just go quickly through these last three groups, which were less common, but the structural group here, these people associate order and repeatability with a true spiritual experience, whereas chaos and illogical happenings are more psychosis. The scalar group is really interested in sort of the volume of the experience, with loud, overpowering experiences being psychosis and more subtle experiences being spiritual. And then this last social individualistic group focuses on their spiritual experiences really fostering connection with other people, whereas psychosis tends to be very inward focused, preoccupied with individual needs and fears. Here are just some quotes from subjects about all this. This is an example of the orthodox method at the top. This is a woman who talks about after she got better from her psychosis, but continued to hear spiritual voices. She says, "My spiritual voices go along with the teachings of Jesus better. It's not so random. The voices now remind me to pay my tithing." This refers to payments to the church, which she saw as being a good thing. This next quote is about the reality validation method. And this person is talking about how you can know that what you're experiencing is real if other people are on the same page as you. And so this person says you can connect spiritual experiences to the experiences of other people. It's not that you're mad, you're rationally sensing a deeper sense of being. And then here's the emotional method. This person says, "The feelings that come with bipolar for me have been so negative and disturbing that I find it easy to see the difference between the two." And she goes on to contrast her spiritual experiences, which are really positive for her. So some other things which I can't dive into for the sake of time today, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I've collected more data here too. So one interesting question is, how are different schemas or these different groups used based on religious background? Do people of certain religious or spiritual backgrounds tend to use one method over the others? I've noticed some small patterns here thus far. For example, the majority of my Catholic subjects endorsed using the Orthodox method, really checking the scriptures, checking with the liturgy and their religious authorities to see if experiences were valid. And this is something that I will continue to explore as I interview more people. Differences revealed by the quantifying consciousness scale. So this is the scale I mentioned at the beginning, which measures about 15 different criteria to help you make sense of altered states of consciousness. And I'm still collecting data here, and we'll be curious to see if there are certain patterns that are widespread. And then differences in elements of mysticism across the two experiences. So I measured this using the Hood mysticism scale, and mysticism here is referring to a kind of a mysterious element of your experiences, one where you feel tapped into an esoteric source of knowledge or power. And here in green, we have the mysticism scores of spiritual experiences. And in orange, we have the mysticism scores of psychosis. And you can see that spiritual experiences tend to be more mystical, but psychosis tends to be pretty mystical too. So finally here, tying this back into the questions I asked at the beginning, is there actually a difference between these two states? You can answer this in a few different ways. First of all, perspectives from the subjects. As I've just gone over, subjects tend to see differences between these states, and they have a lot of ways of describing those differences. If you ask psychiatrists, often what it comes down to at the end of the day is this functional? Is this experience working for you in your life? And if so, sure, keep it. If not, let's treat it as an illness and try to get rid of it. Are both of these states desirable, and should one be avoided? Most of my subjects felt like they did want to avoid psychosis. although not everyone. Some people saw it as a good experience in the end. And then how does this influence precautions we might develop around psychedelic use? I think my major takeaway that I'd like to emphasize is that it's good to have these kinds of conversations. So just explore, what are the different kinds of experiences that you may have because of using psychedelics? Are there some that you like for yourself, and are there some that you don't like for yourself? Are you going to need this to be compatible with the beliefs you already have ahead of time, or are you open to change? Do you need it to be an like an emotionally positive experience or not? Applying some of these key methods that people use to really help people evaluate the experiences they're having and figure out how to tell this narrative for themselves of how these experiences fit into their lives. And so that is the end of my talk, and thank you so much for listening.